Oh, okay.
In about a minute.
I think it is now.
Oh, there it is now.
Okay. We'll just let people come in. Welcome, bienvenue. Let's see. Mm-hmm. Attendees are trickling in. So you can feel free to use the chat function to say hello, bonjour. Good morning, there you go. Hello, Melanie.
I'm trying to practice my French as much as possible. I realize it's a deficiency. Oui. So I will make a few mistakes now and then, but I'm trying.
C'est excellent. Si vous désirez pratiquer ce matin, dire quelques mots de bienvenue ou d'écrire dans la fonction de clavardage, il n'y a pas de problème.
Let's see. Bonjour à tous. You know, I try my best in it because I think it's so important in doing this work.
Yes, and it's with practice, right?
Yep.
I do the same with my Spanish. Whenever I hear it or I go you know, to Spanish-speaking countries, I will speak, I will try, and I will always say, forgive my accent. It's been a while, but let's go, you know, and yeah, and then it flows. It's like writing. Yeah. You never ever forget a language. You never forget that. Here's the language teacher in me speaking, right? Okay. So, okay, I think as attendees coming in, we will kick this off. Alors, j'y vais. Good morning, bonjour à tous et à toutes. Mon nom est Nadine Duguay-Lemay. Je suis la présidente directrice générale de Dialogue Nouveau-Brunswick. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue à notre dialogue public portant sur l'équité, la diversité, l'inclusion et l'anti-racisme. Comment faire de votre organisation une alliée? For those of you watching via Facebook Live, please note that translation is not an available feature for the Facebook Live. It is, however, available within this webinar here today. J'ai le plaisir d'animer aujourd'hui ce dialogue en compagnie de Mylène Lapierre, présidente directrice générale de CPA Nouveau-Brunswick. Bonjour, Mylène.
Thank you so much, Nadine, and good morning, everyone. I'm very proud to be here today representing CPA New Brunswick, and I'm excited to learn more about how our organization can become a leader in fostering equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism, both in and out of the workplace. As one of our key missions points is to contribute toward improving the socio-economic conditions of New Brunswick. I'm very honored to participate in discussing this very important set of topics.
Thank you, Mylène, for your participation today and for CPA New Brunswick's interest in this dialogue. In acknowledgement of the land from which I'm joining you, it is the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which the Wolastoqiyik, the Mi'kmaq, and the Passamaquoddy people first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Wolastoqiyik, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. I'm grateful that we can all virtually join here together today, and grateful too for the first people who shared their ancestral homes with us all. I invite everyone to write in the chat from which unceded territory they are joining us today. On behalf of Dialogue New Brunswick, I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge our commitment to the struggle against systems of oppression that have resulted in profound inequities and against the denial of self-determination rights. We are working actively to deepen our learning at an individual level, provide learning opportunities about anti-racism and decolonization to the sector, and to develop partnerships with organizations serving and led by underrepresented groups.
J'aimerais maintenant partager avec vous quelques informations au sujet du fonctionnement. Tout d'abord, la traduction est disponible pour ceux qui participent à ce webinaire. Vous n'avez qu'à activer la fonction interprétation qui se trouve au bas de votre écran. Les directives sont mentionnées dans le clavardage. Comme ceci est un webinaire, il est normal que vous ne voyez que les panélistes et les animateurs. Vous pouvez participer activement tout au long du dialogue en commentant dans la fonction clavardage ou encore en écrivant votre question à l'aide de la fonction Q&A, foire aux questions. Il est possible de communiquer votre question à une personne spécifique ou encore à tous les panélistes. Ceci s'applique également dans la fonction clavardage, alors que vous pouvez choisir que tous les participants et panélistes voient votre commentaire ou seulement les panélistes. We are joined here today by subject matters experts and members of Dialogue New Brunswick team who have been collaborating together these past few months to develop tools and training with respect to EDI and anti-racism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Purley, Wolastoqey, elder from Tobique First Nations, former director of the Mi'kmaq Wolastoqey Center at UNB. Dr. Wesley Critchlow, professor in the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities at Ontario Tech University. Dr. François Ducharme, managing partner of Conita Talent Inc., a company specializing in people management strategies. Madame Jana Hare, CEO of Spark Leadership Inc., a company specializing in coaching and leadership solutions, and member of the board of directors of Dialogue New Brunswick. Madame Jing Shu, Director of Training at Dialogue New Brunswick, and Mr. Omar Lunen, Training Manager at Dialogue New Brunswick. Welcome, everyone.
Je vous partage une citation d'Arthur Chan pour débuter ce qui nous guide chez Dialogue Nouveau-Brunswick et qui est très approprié pour le thème d'aujourd'hui. La diversité, c'est un fait. L'équité, c'est un choix. L'inclusion, c'est une action et le sentiment d'appartenance, un résultat. Allow me to introduce the format of this dialogue today in case this is the first time you join one of our dialogues. Le but de nos dialogues est d'obtenir une meilleure compréhension sur un sujet et non d'atteindre la résolution. Si à la fin de ce dialogue, vous avez l'impression d'avoir appris quelque chose, et nous espérons que ce sera le cas, notre mission est accomplie. Sachez également que nous publions des rapports sur chacun de nos dialogues et que ceux-ci sont partagés avec les parties prenantes et disponibles au public via notre site web. En ce qui concerne le déroulement d'aujourd'hui, nous allons poser des questions à nos panélistes afin qu'ils et elles puissent nous situer par rapport à leur positionnement sur le sujet d'aujourd'hui. Par la suite, nous aurons du temps pour répondre à quelques questions et nous entretenir avec les participants. En tout temps, les participants dans le webinaire peuvent se prévaloir de la fonctionnalité clavardage pour commenter. Nous vous demandons de respecter les directives suivantes qui s'appliquent ici de la même manière que sur nos plateformes de médias sociaux. Nous invitons chacun à faire preuve de courtoisie et de respect dans la publication de ses commentaires. Les éléments suivants ne seront pas tolérés et seront systématiquement effacés. Les commentaires diffamatoires, abusifs et obscènes. Les déclarations discriminatoires fondées notamment sur le sexe, la religion, la nationalité ou l'orientation sexuelle. Les propos incitant à la haine ou à la violence. À toi, Mylène.
There has been growing concern worldwide about ensuring that workplaces adopt and embrace practices that are equitable, inclusive, and anti-racist to support our diverse workforce. In New Brunswick and in Canada, there is a diverse population that consists of people from different ethnic, gender, immigration background, etc. And it's imperative for the organizations to realize and acknowledge their responsibility of creating a work culture that leads to a highly engaged, innovative, fairly represented and treated workforce. Dialogue NB's journey into EDI and racism started back in early 2019 as the team interviewed CEOs and HR leaders from various organizations to understand their needs with respect to making their workplace equitable, inclusive, and cultivating a sense of belonging. They were surprised to learn that most organizations were looking at being inclusive as hitting quotas. This revealing insight led to having a dialogue last year on the importance of creating a culture by design with subject matters experts, Jana Hare, who is with us today, and Dr. Mario Chiasson. From there, Dialogue NB has been driven to create a framework and model that will enable New Brunswickers to create a culture by design and a social cohesion movement that will have lasting impact on our province. A program that will help organizations operationalize key behaviors and capabilities that will lead to social cohesion, inclusiveness, and a greater sense of belonging is required to move things forward. Today's topic intends to understand the importance of EDI and anti-racism at individual, societal, and organizational levels. Over to you, Nadine.
Merci beaucoup, Mylène, pour ce merveilleux positionnement. Alors, nous allons explorer ce thème en débutant avec la nécessité de parler d'équité, d'inclusion et d'antiracisme avec le Dr. Critchlow, qui travaille depuis longtemps dans ce domaine. Donc, la question, we understand, Dr. Critchlow, you've been working for a very long time on this topic. So this is like second nature to you now. From your perspective, why is it critical for organization to embark on this EDI anti-racism journey at this specific conjuncture in time?
Bonjour à vous, and thank you so much for the kind invitation, introduction, and words. I would like to acknowledge I'm speaking from the Mississaugas, and I also would like to acknowledge that I am also here speaking on land in which not only were there Indigenous people, but also acknowledge that we are all treaty people, and that Africans were also forcefully removed from Africa and brought here as slaves, and that the context of my work is very much framed within the context of understanding historical inequalities, racial injustices, and the impact on EDI. So thank you for the invitation, and I want to congratulate you for doing this work on behalf of New Brunswick, Dialogue New Brunswick. I think first we must understand that this is not a new project, that if we go back to the work of Rosalia Bella, we are over 35 years now, I think, in doing this work. And she really laid out for us, I think, at the time, a template in how to achieve employment equity best practices in ways that guarantee organizations accessing the best pool available of workers. So employment equity legislation, which federally is the most effective tool at promoting this issue, I would say is sort of a guiding frame, and for how we should do this work. But the workplace has changed a lot and continues to change a lot. Fewer private sector workplaces are covered by collective agreements. And because fewer private workplace sectors are covered by collective agreements, we also have to think about how other pieces of legislation or legislative requirements apply to private sector workplaces in addition to government sectors or those that are covered. But the objective is to remove discriminatory barriers for historically marginalized populations. And I want to use it in a broad sense today because in the interest of time. But to keep in mind that COVID-19 has exposed and exacerbated inequalities that we cannot speak today about EDI without speaking about the impact that COVID-19 has now brought on in terms of exacerbating inequalities for groups that have already been historically marginalized. So I ask that as we do this work to consider not just historical, but what is happening today is really, we are seeing how the roots of inequality and the machinations of inequality historically is now coming home to bear true fruit of what we call COVIDian times. And I think COVID and EDI have a lot to learn and blend in from each other intersectionally to make intelligible an understanding of inequality. So these announcements, these two things I think will engender, and I hope it can engender us to think through, what does it mean to have best practices at a workplace that is inclusive, that has a high retention rate, that is accessible for persons with disabilities, that recognizes all the inequalities that exist, but not treat people as though they are seeking some special privileges. And I think it's how we get folks to understand that we're not trying to ask for special privileges, but we're just highlighting the inequities. Inequality anywhere is a threat to equality everywhere. So the quest of achieving a humane society is the removal of inequality.
Great start, Dr. Critchlow. And because you've touched upon COVID-19 pandemic and how it has illustrated those inequalities, I do know that Terry from our team is looking at a poem. I don't know if you've read it. It was published by an anonymous author, and it really speaks to these inequities that we have seen. So Terry will be publishing this poem very soon. Thank you. Thank you for this opening, and we will circle back.
Thank you.
We will now turn it over to Dr. Perley. Dr. Perley, we thank you for your participation today. Can you please speak to your lived experiences and observations about the integration and treatment of Indigenous workers in New Brunswick organizational landscape?
You are on mute, Dr. Perley.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to welcome everyone in my language, in my ancestral language. I think it's important to hear the first language of this area now called New Brunswick. The first language, of course, is my Wolastoqey language, and of course, in the Miramichi area, northern part of New Brunswick, the first language is the Mi'kmaq language. So I think it's important to hear that language in all of the gatherings in New Brunswick. Kolasik wopa lirabik, kamajulida has legakim salt perche, Williba Mouse Wagano. Kamajulida has Wallamsdi Williba Mouse even, Wallamskat Miss Widama and Siwana. Gadget Gazet, who joke him in Wallamgisi, Wallam Miss Hanawa, Gulwadal Naga, Gazaltam Wagan Dutch, Nemetonia. So in my language, I welcome everyone, and in my language, I also mentioned that it's important to learn about, in my language, which means in my language, good teachings, good life teachings. And the Navajos identify this as walking in beauty. When you walk in beauty, you walk with love, with respect, and live in harmony with all of creation. So it's important for us to embrace that teaching from our ancestors. I also want to acknowledge that first that I am joining you from traditional Wolastoqey, unceded, unsurrendered territory of my ancestors. I am at St. Mary's First Nation right now. And I also want, before I answer the question, I also want to acknowledge that June is the National Indigenous History Month. And to celebrate that, I want to share with you one historical fact of relating to New Brunswick. And the fact is, the history of New Brunswick is more than the history of Anglophones and Francophones. The history of New Brunswick is the history of Anglophones, Francophones, and before New Brunswick became a province, we had the Wabanaki people here. We had the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey and the Passamaquoddy here in New Brunswick. And so it's important for us to acknowledge that, and I appreciate the land acknowledgement that was shared earlier. And then, of course, we also have to remember that my ancestors signed peace and friendship treaties with the British Crown. And these treaties, of course, have been validated by the Supreme Court of Canada. And of course, finally, I want to share with you in this History Month, that we're, as Dr. Christopher has mentioned, we're all treaty people. And as treaty people, we have a responsibility to know one another, to understand one another, to respect one another, and to live in harmony with one another. So in addressing the question, I'd like to first of all share my, and I'll keep this short. You know, I know my time is short, but I won't be able to elaborate on the points I'm making, but I want to make sure I cover all of the points I wanted to cover with regards to today's public forum. I'd like to share my experiences very briefly, my experiences with individual and systemic racism in New Brunswick. I've experienced racism in the education system. I've experienced racism in the justice system and the political system, the health system, economic system, and of course, with the Department of Indigenous Affairs and Northern Development. And I'll go directly into the education system because those were painful experiences when I reflect on them now. I was a student at the Tobig Indian Day School back, my first year was in 1956. And that was my first exposure to colonial education and education based on racism. And basically in that learning environment, we weren't allowed to speak our language. We were strapped for speaking our language. We weren't allowed to even mention our culture in any way, our ceremonies and so on. So those were painful experiences as I reflect on them now. And I was always in fear. For 6 years while I was attending the Tobig Indian Day School, I was in fear every single day because I was in fear of being strapped for speaking my ancestral language. And then I'll move on to the public school system. You know, when after completing the Indian Day School, I went on to the public school not too far from Tobig First Nation. And the treatment of First Nation students was the same as the treatment of First Nation students in Tobig Indian Day School. Once again, in that public school, we weren't allowed to speak our language. And we experienced racism every single day. We had to deal with stereotypes, you know, walking down a hallway. So once in a while, you would hear someone holler savage or barbarous people in the hallways. And of course, it caused a lot of friction between the students from Tobig First Nation and of course the non-Indigenous students from the town close to us. I also experienced racism in the post-secondary institution where I attended. And in the way that I wasn't able, there weren't any courses that allowed me to learn about the history of my people, of my ancestors. Once again, language courses were not offered. Mi'kmaq language courses or Wolastoqey language courses, they were not offered in the post-secondary institutions. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, you know, dealt with stereotypes and misconceptions every single day. You know, I would have to deal with misconceptions, you know, where you would hear people say, well, they don't want to work. All they want to do is stay on welfare, you know. Or they would say something like, well, you know, they think they have special status. So I had to deal with them as a student in the Indian, well, not so much Indian Day School, but in the public school and the university level. And I also had to deal with them when I was an employee of the Department of Education as Aboriginal consultant. So I had to address those misconceptions and educate my colleagues in the education department and educate, of course, the students, the non-Indigenous students at the university. And then, of course, as I reflect on them, these experiences, these painful experiences of race that I faced, shaped my life. You know, from an early age. I think when I was at the middle school level, I wanted to transform the education system because of what that system had the impact it had on me. You know, it had major impact on my self-esteem, on my identity. and it was trying to erase my language from from my own life. So because of those experiences, I wanted to transform the education system, and that influenced me in terms of the profession that I pursued after it while I was at the university. So I became an educator, and I wanted to change the system so that that system that I experienced will not be the same system that uh, current students, Wabanaki students, and future students will not face. Hopefully, the system will change so that the curriculum will cover Wabanaki worldviews, history, traditions, belief systems, knowledge systems, philosophies, and so on. So, and I'm quite pleased with the direction that the education, the public school system is now taken. So we will see more Wabanaki content in the curriculum of the public school system in the very near future. We will see Wabanaki teachers in the public school system because we need to have role models in the public schools so that our students will say to themselves, well, if he or she can make it and become a teacher in this public school, then I want to be a teacher as well. So just moving on, I know time is limited. So my experience is I became the agent of decolonization, indigenization, and reconciliation. And for me, that's anti-racism, because if you implement the recommendations of TRC calls to action, you are actually addressing systemic racism. So that's why I became, I'm a full supporter of course, the TRC calls to action. I'm a full supporter of decolonization, where you transform the education system from a rigid system to a flexible system where our knowledge system will be recognized as well in public schools. And then, of course, the final question, the question that's asked, why is it critical for New Brunswick's organizations to drive EDI and anti-racism practices in the workplace? Well, as I reflect on this question, um, it's important because we need to improve conditions. We need to improve outcomes. We want to ensure that in the education system, our students will graduate with a strong cultural foundation, and they will have the skills they need to carry on and be accepted at university levels. So they will address the low the high dropout rates that we had in the past, low academic performance. But if we are successful in transforming the education system and make it into a culture-based education, then we will see outcomes, improved outcomes, not just in education. If we see changes in the health system and economic system and justice, we will see improvements in those outcomes as well. And then, of course, what's important for me in current contemporary situation of Wabanaki people in New Brunswick is we need to have a voice in the provincial legislative assembly. Right now, we have anglophones and francophones in the provincial legislative assembly, but we don't have a Wabanaki voice. And even though we're one of the original inhabitants of what is now New Brunswick, we should have a voice in there. We should have a Passamaquoddy voice, a Wolastoqey voice, and a Mi'kmaq voice as well. And I want to close with this. This is a native meditation that I found in the publication Wisdom of the Elders. And this addresses the question, and this addresses the focus for today's public forum. I will greet the day with love in my heart. Love is the greatest secret of success of how I can help my Native community. The unseen power of love can open the hearts of men and women. I will make love my greatest enemy. I will make love my greatest weapon, and I will use its power well. Love will be my shield to repulse the arrows of hate and the spears of anger. Love will let me walk the path of a peaceful, strong, joyful, wise warrior. And that's my goal in life. I want to be that warrior. Thank you. Maliwan, Walalin, merci.
Thank you, Dr. Perley.
Waliwan. Before we just move on to Dr. Ducharme, David, I've just noticed that there's a question that might just be appropriate to answer at this time, given your work with the Mi'kmaq Wolastoqey Center at UNB. It is from Don Desprez-Smith, who says, is there a document website that helps learn the correct pronunciation of Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey place names in New Brunswick? And so I know you've done a lot of work on that regards, and I've seen resources. Are you able to reference a few or put it in the chat?
If the person is asking for pronunciation, we don't have that yet for place names in New Brunswick, but it's in the works. I know there are there's a couple of researchers at UNB who are interested because they also want to be able to pronounce the both the Wolastoqey place names and the Mi'kmaq place names in the languages. So you're not going to see it yet, but you will see it in the very near future.
Okay, I believe Dr. Critchlow, you have something to add on this question?
No, I was disagreeing with David so much that I don't know how I could add anything more, but to say that I think the one piece that came to my mind is that equity does not mean treating everyone the same, because there's an assumption that it's about treating everyone the same, and he highlights for us that a decolonized approach is so critical for understanding how we shift from the colonial to the decolonized, and that in trying to do this work, it's about understanding inequality in a substantive way. And to have a substantive analysis requires that we always historicize these things. And I just wanted to add in terms of that, this is also the decade for people of African descent, and how timely that decade for people of African descent, Indigenous decade, I think went by a couple of years ago. But these are decades that the UN lays out a framework for how to achieve equality. And if we go back to the decade for Indigenous people, the decade for persons with disabilities, African descent, etc., we would see that EDI already has a number of frameworks from the UN to also apply in the work we are doing here, and to not confuse Indigenous issues with EDI issues. They are distinct, they are unique, they have very grounded constitutional rights, crown rights, fiduciary rights, and that we are not asking people to somehow give special privileges, but we are saying these rights are already enshrined in law, and now we must enact those rights. And so I think it's so good what he said, that we are not in competition, and that this was eloquently and well done. Thank you so much, David.
Merci.
Yeah, thank you for those. I just want to respond. I really appreciate his comments as well, and I just wanted to share with you that I have heard teachers who will tell me I treat all my students the same, and I would always complain about that, because when you treat your students the same, then you're ignoring their cultural differences. So I've always asked them to remember there's cultural differences. Learning styles for our students are not the same as learning styles for non-Indigenous students. So we're not asking for equality. We're asking for recognition of the differences and addressing those differences in the classroom. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Nous allons nous tourner maintenant par Dr. François Ducharme. Vous êtes un consultant, n'est-ce pas, en leadership, dans la gestion de talent, qui a travaillé avec des gouvernements, des organisations de toute taille, au niveau national, international, et qui facilite l'apprentissage et les opportunités de développement pour les cadres et les dirigeants. Qu'avez-vous observé au cours des 30 dernières années en ce qui concerne les efforts des organisations pour être équitables et inclusives? Et dans la même veine de ces observations-là, quelles seraient les lacunes que vous avez observées?
Alors, merci beaucoup de m'inviter à ce workshop, et je vous remercie aussi des mots pleins de sagesse que nous avons entendus de Dr. Critchlow et de Perley. Je vous parle ici du territoire de la nation Algonquin Anishinaabeg, Et je suis bien heureux d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui. Your question had actually two sub-questions to it. You know, what has happened in the last 30 years in terms of organizational effort, been being equitable and inclusive, and then what are the gaps? And I think these are two important area to explore. So the first one is around in the last 30 years, what I've noticed in terms of organization and government of all walks of life is that there's been a murmur at the beginning when I started the practice, a murmur around the need to consider DEI and anti-racism as a pillar of organizational culture and organizational practices. And now I think what we're hearing is a scream about this. So this has been happening in the last 30 years. It started a little bit before I started my practice. But the help from governments, the help from legislation, the pressures from court decisions as well, has forced organization to do two things, I believe. And the first one is what I would call mechanical changes. And what I mean by mechanical changes is that they looked at their HR levers and HR processes, and they started to look at what would be fair, what would be equitable in terms of compensation, for example, fair, equitable, and looking at all of their HR levers in terms of recruitment, selection, promotion, succession planning. Are we there yet? No, we're not. I see a lot of organizations that are still using approaches that would not allow individual to shine in terms of their diversity and the diverse mindset. Just a quick example. In organization, we see a lot of people using competency profiles, and it's a set of single way of showing competencies that they believe are linked to performance at work. And while we know that there's different ways of actually being successful in a work setting, force-fitting people into one way might actually be suboptimal. We talked about different learning style, for example. That is critical to look at different learning styles and also different working style and leadership styles. And these are all influenced from cultural background and individual background and history as well. So some of the work that has been done has been extremely positive and powerful and has moved the yardstick in the right direction. Mais sommes-nous arrivés? De toute évidence, non. Je vois que les efforts encore dans les organisations sont fragmentés. Ils varient énormément d'une industrie à l'autre. Certaines industries sont beaucoup plus en avance en ce qui a trait à la promotion de ces principes de base et de ces droits humains, alors que d'autres sont un petit peu plus en retard là-dedans. And it's interesting because I'll just mention that in about 20 years ago, I was working in a high-tech firm as an embedded consultant, and I was walking down the cafeteria with the president, and I looked around and I said, "Wow, you just made a comment saying, isn't that wonderful? We have truly you have truly the United Nations in your workforce, and at all level, and it was wonderful, very progressive organization." And the CEO, I remember, he looked at me and laughed and said, "Not only it's the right thing to do, Francois, it's truly the right thing to do, but it's also the right business thing to do as well. You know, if I have employees that brings in different mindset, different thinking, different ideas, if they also bring us the needs of their constituent, you know, in the population, their customers, we'll be able to adapt our service or approaches in a ways that our competitors won't be able to do it." And this individual really opened up my eyes to the fact that there is a top line impact and a bottom line impact. I'm an industrial organizational psychologist, so of course these variables are things I really care about. So the first step is I think the efforts in the right direction. What's missing? What is missing for me is now we need to move towards a culture. We need to start working on the culture that exists within the organization. Maybe the infrastructure is there, but what about the unwritten norms? What are the unwritten policies, the way things are done, the belief systems that exist in an organization? Most of them are unwritten, and therefore they may impact significantly individuals. We've heard recently, you know, in the last year, what has been a big topic, for example, is the notion of white privilege that we're seeing across North America and Europe as being an area that we need to tackle. You know, the fact that we as white Canadian, or I as a white Canadian, you know, I've long been able to ignore or even for some of us deny the advantage that we enjoyed just by being white has been counterproductive both in society, but also in organization. And it also has permeated the way some organizations, not all, have treated their employees. And I've seen this all the time. We had an example, and I had lived an example where in my company I was in previously, when I propose an idea, when I propose an approach or a market strategy, it was accepted. When my colleague from a different background was saying exactly the same strategy, it wasn't. So there are some advantages that our people do benefit, and we need to recognize that these benefits are not allowing a large segment of our worker population, at all levels for that matter, to really shine and contribute to the level of their ability and their desire. On that notion, as a psychologist, when I approach these topics, often, there's a great author that says there's the 3 Ds that people reflect when they are faced with facts or belief systems that contradict their own. The 3 Ds are being denied, distance, and dismantle. And I think these are strategies that I still see in organization when I approach senior leaders around this, and they will say, no, of course not. Everybody works extremely hard to be promoted. For example, a lot of them have been hiding behind the principle of le mérite, méritocratie, as being a we all deserve it. And there's a belief system, in our society that good thing happens to people that are good and bad thing happens to people who are not good. So if you're not promoted, you don't merit it. And I think that we need to tackle that one. The meritocracy, I think, is one of these dismantling strategies or a defense mechanism that we've seen in the organization to try to say everybody's treated fairly or the same way. If you work hard, good thing will happen to you. On that, and I'll conclude, I'm coaching an executive at this point who was telling me, I worked extremely hard. I had hardship to become a VP and who I am. So I merit being a VP, and I work extremely hard, the hardship. And he went on and explained all the hardship that he faced. And I was right. Yeah, that's true. This person, but what about the other individual who had the same hardship that you just explained to me, in addition to all the other hardship and invisible barriers that were also this person, she had to fight. And what about those? And that's where the penny dropped. That's where realizing we all have hardship. Some have it more than others. And we need to, so that's what I'm thinking is our next gap, is working on culture, organizational culture.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Ducharme. Et je vous invite à répondre aux commentaires ou aux questions si vous en voyez qui sont appropriées. Merci déjà à Omar, Dr. Critchlow. Je vois que vous répondez dans le clavardage. Donc, merci de continuer à faire ça. J'invite tout le monde à le faire. Mylène, on continue.
Parfait. So we'll now turn it over to Jana. Jana, you developed a framework to broaden the dialogue organization program, which laid the foundation of enabling New Brunswick's organizations by providing training and measurement tools to build an equitable and fair culture and to cultivate a sense of employee belonging. What was the premise of which you built this framework?
Thank you, Mylène. And thank you for the invitation to be here today, Nadine, and I'm pleased to be here with this esteemed group of panelists. I am here in Moncton, joining you from Moncton, the unceded Mi'kmaq territory. So Nadine and I I built the framework of dialogue organizations after a discussion that Nadine and I had in the spring of 2020. We were talking about the current dialogue organizations that she had created, and she was sharing her vision for this program and how we're going to start addressing some of these issues within organizations. A big part of our workforce, our population, they go to work. We have an opportunity to address these issues within organizations. So I shared some of my learnings with her that I was having around creating cultures by design versus having a culture by default. That triggered a deeper conversation between Nadine and I, and we wondered how we might expand the current dialogue organizations program that she had been working on. so that we could begin to operationalize diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging behaviors within organizations. We got really curious about how could we operationalize some of these behaviors and have a bigger impact on New Brunswickers, those specifically working in organizations. We wondered how are we going to measure this, and what are the appropriate levers to be successful in creating a culture by design, specifically DEIB, culture by design, working with these organizations. And so I created the framework through the lens of belonging, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it wasn't just about training people on some of these concepts. What we needed to do was identify the key behaviors that would lead to systemic cultural change. We also started having a conversation about what are the systems in organizations that need to change. I think the work that we need to do in organizations is we need to, instead of focusing on systems of disadvantage and biases within our organizations, instead we need to develop a full understanding of diversity and talk about the systems of privilege that exist in organizations. I think that would be a really good start, to start talking about privilege that exists in organizations. So some of the behaviors that we identified would include integrating practices and behaviors like curiosity, active listening, empathy, personal and shared responsibility, compassion, trust, open dialogue, resiliency. These aren't skills that are taught in organizations naturally. And these are the skills that are required to move people towards an understanding of diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging. In organizations, there's a lot of talk around engagement. Are employees engaged? I invite organizations to think about, do employees feel like they belong? Do they feel respected? Do they feel heard? Do they feel seen? Once this happens in organizations, it's going to lead to a sense of belonging in an organization, a sense of feeling valued for their contributions within an organization, which will lead to mutual trust and respect, which will lead to a sense of belonging in organizations. And so it was exciting to develop this framework for Dialogue New Brunswick. After I developed this framework, I joined the board, thankfully, of Dialogue New Brunswick, because I believe wholeheartedly in what we stand for. We need to have tough conversations in organizations. People like me need to advocate and become allies and invite conversation about some of these tough topics. Nadine and Dialogue New Brunswick is doing it fabulously well. I'm thrilled to be part of it. I think that we all have a responsibility to continue within our organizations to have these conversations with our employees. So I'll stop there for the sake of time. There's much more I could say, but I'll stop there and we'll continue on.
Thank you so much, Jana.
You're welcome.
Jane and Omar, so you have been developing the ADI and anti-racism training program and tools for organizations. Could you please share any insights from these lenses on why organizations should drive EDI?
Okay, maybe I start first. Yeah, very quickly about myself. I have been working for a few international companies, and my career started in Shanghai, China, and then I moved to Singapore and working in Singapore for an international company for 8 years, and then moved to Canada as a new immigrant. I just landed Canada 3 weeks ago. So, you know, as a specialist in talent management, learning, employee development, and organizational development, I realized that EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion is becoming an increasingly hot topic in international companies, because those companies realize that it is so important to have a diverse team in order to boost the innovation, in order to boost the collaboration in the workplace. And at the same time, they realize that being in EDI workplace would have a lot of benefit to their financial results. So bringing those perspective, and then when I look at organizations currently and what organization really need, to be honest, I really realized that organizations have been doing a lot of education in order to address awareness gap in the workplace when it comes to EDI. And at the same time, I realized that organizations would need some help or some support in terms of the toolbox. So they need some tools to help the organizations to change the culture. So what are the tools they would need? The tools they need in terms of awareness, in terms of measurement, in terms of HR processes. That means put the process in place and have the discipline. So that is why our very first task in helping organization in achieving this goal is to develop tools. And currently we have developed tools, for example, EDI training programs. Very happily that we have just finished the pilot test of this training programs, and we received positive feedback. I just give you very quick data that 90% of the participants in the test group agree and strongly agree that this EDI program is very much needed in the workplace, and they are highly recommending to other people. And of course, we look at the feedback, and we're listening to them, listening to the feedback, and also we're learning from them. And we are hearing that people wanted to add a little bit more depth, more breadth in terms of the concept, in terms of the application. So we're working on that. Omar, you wanted to add some comments?
Sure, thank you, Jane. And good morning and welcome everybody. I'm just excited to be here, and I'm really thankful to be part of this project. I'm really thankful for all the work that I've learned and all the things that I've done with Jane. And I hope that in the midst of this conversation outside of here, you're all finding peace and time to work on what's been happening globally with COVID-19 as well. I'm going to dovetail off of what Jane was saying in terms of the corporate necessity of having EDI. Of course, the effects, if we're just talking about why the buy-in, we're looking at things like studies showing that diverse organizations are more successful at recruiting and retaining talent. People don't want to quit if they feel like they belong. And we're talking about people also from marginalized communities. That sense of belonging is very important, not only to their communities, but to their workplace. I talk to a lot of my clients because I'm an educator, but I'm also a registered massage therapist in the province of Ontario and have been registered since 2006. I talk to them about the rule of thirds. You spend a third of your life working, a third of your life sleeping, a third of your life doing everything else. The first two have to be very comfortable. And I'm not just talking about the physical sense. So back to the sense of belonging, inclusive workplaces definitely maximize talent and productivity. We talk about innovation and group performance. So how diversity in teams are critical for innovation. Inclusion having an effect on team performances and problem solving. If I can talk about the educational perspective, because I'm a graduate of Ontario Tech University, and we do a lot of focus on adult learning and collaborative learning. And one of the key components of adult learning specifically is honoring and appreciating the perspectives from each learner. And there are several studies that show that this adds very rich perspective and increased respect for individual thought and individuals, their contributions, and greater creativity, efficiency, and completion of work, and openness. In designing the tool itself for EDI, we know that there are a ton of laws that, from an ethical and a moral perspective, are in place. You just have to be aware of them. the Disabilities and Accessibility Act, Canadian Multiculturalism Act, Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Democratic Act, Mobility Rights. There's a gamut of them. And this is really just framework that we all need to be aware of all the time. But that's from a Canadian perspective. With this, we took the lens and using Nadine's phrase, taking that helicopter view of what's going on. We need to look at Canada, but we wanted to focus on New Brunswick and understanding that there is also a Human Rights Act in New Brunswick and looking at the lens of diversity in New Brunswick and seeing what changes need to happen there. There's also the look of what we call the 50-30 rule, which is a prospectus from, it was Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada with the government of Canada as well. And the 50-30 rule just basically says they want to attain gender parity and significant representation of all cultures of at least 30% everywhere. We're talking about executive boards as well. So if you look at your area and if 30% of the population is not represented in the company and 50% is not represented in the executive board, you've got work to do. So all of these perspectives were things that we wanted to input in the training tool and make sure that we're not just reading things here, people. We're not just saying we read a book and we got the certificate and we can high five somebody because we watched the Netflix and subscribed to the Crave. No, we need to be doing the work. This is changing and shifting beliefs and understandings that have been there for a very long time. And even though you may not have been there when these things have happened, we have all been privileged in different ways from that. Me, as a heterosexual Black man in Canada, I have privileges that a lot of people don't have. This includes sitting here with all of you and speaking to you from a laptop with Wi-Fi on my headset. So once you understand where your privilege is, you can advocate for everybody in your corner and your company who does not have it. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you. Really great insights. Wow.
Omar, if I may, I'm so happy you talked about the 50-30 because in our interviews with some of these CEOs and HR managers 2 years ago, I still recall vividly one of the VPHR boasting about the fact that their company, which is a significant large-sized company here in New Brunswick, stated that 4% of their workforce was diverse. And so, okay, I figured let's maybe cut the person a break. 4% of New Brunswick's population comes, it has a diverse demographic, but I really like that you're challenging organization. These are the targets. So if you're still looking at EDI and anti-racism as a quota-led initiative, well, at the very least, at least hit those targets of 50-30. So thank you so much for talking to that. Okay, so I think I'm going to jump into our last question because I really want to hear your thoughts on this one, and then we'll open up the Q&A and just in between talk, kind of say comments that on things that we've heard. So this is to all of you. What do you feel is the biggest obstacle for organizations to becoming true allies, and what concrete actions do you believe should be taken as the next step? So anybody wants to kick that one off? David, you're unmuted. I don't know if you want to go.
Okay, sure. All right, thank you. The greatest obstacle in any organization, doesn't matter if it's justice, education, economic, political, the greatest obstacle is changing mindsets. The mindsets within the organization. We have certain mindsets in relation to First Nations people. Those mindsets are very negative in terms of how they define the First Nations people, Lusthuri, Wabanaki people. So, and I noticed that when I was with the education department, and of course, I was determined to change the mindset, especially of the teachers and the administrators of the public school system. So what I did at the education department to change the mindset was to have initiate what we call a Circle of Understanding program within the department. And in this program, there's two components to it. One is for teachers and administrators, and the other one is for students, non-Indigenous students, target them to help them to understand Wabanaki people. On the teacher / administrator side, I would in-service the teachers on a regular basis, on a monthly basis, and educate them about the history of Wabanaki people, and of course, sharing information about learning styles, effective teaching strategies, and so on. And then every summer, we would also have cultural immersion for teachers. And of course, we immerse them in the culture. We ask them to be involved in the ceremonies of our ancestors, the sweat lodge ceremony, the sunrise ceremony, the sacred pipe ceremony, and so on. And then we would also ask them to learn a bit of Wolastoqey greetings, depending on where they were teaching. If they're teaching in Wolastoqey, then we would teach them Wolastoqey greetings. If they're teaching in Miramichi area or Moncton area, then we would teach them greetings in the Mi'kmaq language. So that was an attempt to change the mindsets, and because we wanted to ensure that this organization, the public school system, will have culturally competent service providers, and that's what we need for every single organization in New Brunswick. Because look at New Brunswick now. We're a multicultural society, and that means we have to ensure that everyone within those organizations, it isn't enough just to say, I'm going to recruit 5 or 6 Wabanaki teachers in the organization and not change the environment. You know, if the environment is still an oppressive environment in terms of not recognizing Wolastoqey culture or Mi'kmaq culture, then you will end up, and so many comments have been made about belonging. They will not have that sense of belonging within an organization, and they will end up leaving. So we have to ensure that in addition to increasing the numbers, there has to be a policy on race relations, on diversity, and to ensure that the Wabanaki people, and of course others as well, who are in the different organizations, they will experience it will be a positive experience, and they will want to stay there and grow within that organization, because they know that this organization is respectful. This organization it believes in the principle of unity in diversity, and this organization is also believes in living in harmony with all. And so it's important for us to have. I would even suggest that we should have cultural immersion for all civil servants, all MLAs, all leaders of different organizations. So mindsets, we have to change the mindsets.
Okay. Thank you, David. Dr. Critchlow, I see you.
Thank you so much. I want to be cautious about training and say we cannot train our way out of inequality. Training has to be done strategically if we want to talk about change. So yes, training is an aspect of organizational change, but you cannot train your way out of inequality. So what do I mean by that? Well, there are ways in which I think training has become co-opted and repackaged in a neoliberal way that refuses to challenge indifferences. And it sometimes has a tendency to maintain the status quo and more so than challenge inequalities. So I understand that we must talk about education, but it must not stand in the way of justice. So Dr. King asked us, how do we move beyond the aesthetics of equity tokenism? And what we have to ask ourselves is, since his challenge of moving beyond the aesthetics of equity of tokenism and the Abella Commission's report, we have moved into a more neoliberal repackaging of racial justices and racial injustices. Is it possible to speak about EDI without talking about indigenization, decolonization, and slavery? Is it possible to have these conversations in the absence of those things so that folks really understand the machinations, the historicity, and the context of which diversity is not going to be only an objective to be managed and measured with predictable frames, but one in which we must remain pragmatic about the approaches of abstracting from equity the notion of perpetual structural disadvantages. We have to attach a critical race analysis, a critical gender analysis, a critical queer analysis, and all these different intersections, but not at the expense of the other. In other words, EDI work, in order to have this change, we have to be clear it's not a competition. It's about trying to get everybody to actualize their full human potential, and that when you have fully actualized your potential, others will do the same, and we live in a better society. The Chase Bank in the US just did a study which says that the US, if was not for racial inequality, would have had another 200 and something trillion dollars to their GDP today, because if they did not discriminate against people. Discrimination costs. In other words, what does that mean? Racial injustices and the racial project has created inequalities in ways that has not benefited society, but only kept society back from advancing. And therefore, the racial project of EDI has to be made explicit. We are not speaking about whiteness in ways that is about disrupting it. Sometimes we speak about whiteness as a very comfortable project to be managed, but not to be disrupted. So how we speak about whiteness as a form of property is very different from speaking about whiteness as unconscious bias. Property as in a way in which property that was owned through the historicity of slavery and decolonization. That is how white property became dispossession of indigenous people's land that has gone unchallenged. So I think we need to get back to some of the entrenched historical notions that has created Canada, and to unpack it in ways that we are not trying to seek competition, but to have serious conversations about inequities, that in order to bring about transformative change, yes, we have to collect data, but the data must be disaggregated. When you collect data and it's disaggregated, what policies or objective do you have in mind for changing? When we hire, are we doing an individual hire? Are we doing a cluster hire? Are we doing a target hire? What is the objective of these hires? So the diagnostic for EDI has to be one that is very much built into an objective of change, not maintaining the status quo. And EDI work all too often gets packaged and repackaged as an object to be managed and not an object for change. So we need to talk about an object of change and find ways to address them, and employment equities is one of the many ways in which we'll do that.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Critchlow. François, je pense que tu voulais faire une intervention sur ceci?
Oui, en effet, there's a question being asked by Jabna and as well Raymond about what are the levers. You know, is training is critical, but is it sufficient? It cannot be a one-off, and I would fully agree with this. Training is wonderful, but I find that the HR levers that are available to organization to advance the course of D&I are fragmented at this point. So imagine, if you will, that organization would hire people with such important mindset, as Dr. Purley was mentioning, would promote people with such mindset, would train people, would reward individual based on some of those mindsets. All of these HR levers that are available would come to bear. So you need to actually, the principle of behavioral modification applies here. When I started my career as a counseling psychologist and tried to do behavioral modification, we needed to convince the head, the heart, and the actions of people. Not only one of them, it won't work. So, the laws and the regulation convince the head. Everybody would most hopefully agree that, yeah, that makes sense, that we should be promoting anti-racism. I hope that most people's head would say that. But what about the heart, the emotional reaction that people say, hold on, am I going to lose something out of this? And that leads to inertia. And the action, what does it look like for me to promote these things as, in my case, a white middle-aged man? So organization who has worked on change do it consistently. They do it in a disciplined fashion. It's a multi-pronged HR approach, and not only HR, it's not HR, it's organizational wide. And it works towards, time, a comment from Raymond, wait on time, time will change everything. Time don't change everything. That's why history repeats itself. So I agree with Raymond on that one. It has to be consistent, coherent. It has to be also sometimes encouraging people to showcase the right behavior, the right mindsets, and sometimes incenting people on this. How many executive I meet have a part of their bonus, and I know that this is mechanical and people would probably cringe on it, but based on those types of obtaining scores in employee engagement belong to surveys, that is encouraging. Very few. Some do, most don't. It's starting though. It's starting from boards of directors are starting to do that. So multi-pronged approach. It's based also on the notion of social dynamic theories. If you have a critical mass of people who starts thinking, believing, acting, engaging with those mindsets of tolerance and accommodation and curiosity and humility, then it will have an effet d'entraînement, an effet that will lead the rest of the people to go in that same direction. I don't think we have that critical mass in many organizations. Some, federal government is in the right direction. More work has to be done. I know the Bank of Canada is doing wonderful work there, but more work has to be done, and others like that. We can look at those organizations, and you'll notice none of them have a training-only approach. They measure the behaviors because those are the behaviors that are going to be done.
Merci beaucoup, François. Jane, Omar invites you to comment or answer that last question.
Yeah, so when it comes to the biggest obstacle in the organizations to drive ED, I may have some thoughts regarding three things that I wanted to call it out. The first thing is the leadership commitment. Leadership commitment in terms of how committed our executive team is to put energy into this initiative, how committed this CEO of this organization, or how committed general manager in terms of this topic.
Jane?
People say, yes?
Okay, you were just breaking out a little bit. I was just checking on your connection.
Is that okay now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so when I talk about leadership commitment, I remember people say that the corporate culture is the general manager's culture. So if the GM, if the CEO is very much passionate about this topic and is very much committed and willing to invest money and invest time in this topic, and that will be a very, very great start to drive the culture in this organization. The second thing I wanted to mention is put the process in place. A lot of companies wanted to improve or wanted to drive the culture, but they need the help to create a process. So the process should include tools which are mentioned by François just now and mentioned by other people just now in terms of, for example, recruitment, the tools in the recruitment, the tools in the training and development, the tools in talent management, the tools in managing compensation. So there are multiple tools that can be put into place, especially in HR processes, to help this organization to remove systematic discrimination or unconscious bias. And then the third thing is the measurement. We put the process in the place, and we wanted to know where are we now, so that we can make a decision on the next step. Okay, so measurement is also very important. I noticed that a lot of companies are kind of afraid of doing measurement because, you know, sometimes measurement is scary. It gives people some kind of like a score, and some people were happy, some people are not happy about it. But measurement is essential. If you don't measure, you don't perform. So these are the three things I wanted to call out. And the last thing I wanted to mention is EDI is the journey. It is not a one-day thing. It is not a one-year thing. It is a journey that we need a lot of discipline to continue the journey, and believe that with this EDI effort, we will be successful financially, culturally, and creating a very, very equitable and fair and accommodating workplace.
All right, thank you so much, Jane. So Omar, Jenna will let you have the final word, unless Omar, you wanted the final word. Which one of you wants to go?
I'd love for Janet to have the final word. I think I'm gonna just get what I gotta say out of the way.
All right.
And thank you, Jane, for your insights, and Dr. Critchlow as well for speaking to the financial, the impacts of not doing the work. And I also see that Ashley Brooks in the comments did mention that a lot of racial biases can be subconscious. Let me just go to the walking the talk part, okay? Being real, I'm gonna start with a quote by Will Smith. This happened a few years ago where he was saying that racism isn't getting worse, it's getting filmed. We saw at the start of the pandemic where people were already worried about their finances. It was unpredictable. They were scared about what was going on health-wise. We were seeing all kinds of crazy things happen. We mentioned UFOs and nobody blinked an eye. Like, this is how stressed people have been. And then we saw the tragedy with George Floyd, which was literally the boiling point. And it really opened up our eyes to a lot of other things. There was the issue in Central Park where a woman weaponized her whiteness, if I will, to say, well, if you tell me to put my dog on a leash, I'm gonna call the police to tell them that a Black man is assaulting me. And there were issues and issues and issues. And that's just talking about the Black population. Let's just say that Canadians love to romanticize the idea that our history is very different from our neighbors in the South. It is exactly the same. The only difference is, and I like to call it, in Canada, we have closet bigotry. It only shows its face when there's a mitigating circumstance or there's a magnet group, whether it's another person or a group of people. We all have our biases and we need to address them. What I think should be done from a corporate perspective is, in patois, my background's Jamaican, we say, see and blind, hear and deaf. We want to avoid deaf ears and blind eyes. We want to identify when there's an issue that happens and act upon it. Not just see it and say, this is not my business, but be involved. If there is inequality anywhere, it affects us all on every level. The other thing that I want to make sure that we're being aware of is performative alliance. We want allyship, true allyship. But I'm going to talk about two companies because Francois, merci beaucoup, he was talking about looking at other organizations for leading the charge and what companies were doing very well. I mean, I know Dr. Critchlow has also mentioned BMO does an amazing job with EDI as well, as does Dialogue MB. When we're talking about performative allyship, I want to look at Band-Aid, the company, everybody knows Band-Aid bandages, and Ben & Jerry's. So during what happened with George Floyd, Band-Aid, along with a few other companies, basically said, you know what? We see that there is a disparity, and what we're going to do is release a whole line of bandages that have ethnic colors. I don't know about y'all, but Black people have been having cuts since 1948 when the company opened, just saying. And putting out bandages now, it's kind of like putting socks on a chicken. I don't care if the colors match. It's weird, bro. Don't do it. It just looks awkward. as a company to jump on the bandwagon automatically when you see an issue happening. I see what you're trying to do, but it's awkward. Now let's look at Ben & Jerry's. They actually created a few ice cream flavors with names talking about dismantling white privilege, and the proceeds went to organizations to help with discrimination, to help with all of the issues in the US. But Ben & Jerry's has been doing this work since their inception, not only with the environment, with anything that you can think about. So I want to make sure that I'm encouraging anybody who is in the space or the place to make change, to affect change within themselves and within their circles. Make sure that this change comes from within. And as Jane says, it's a difficult process. It's not a one-day thing. It's going to take time. But as Canadians, we are good at holding hands when it comes to celebrating the Canadians winning, as Dr. Purley was saying. We celebrate all the time. And this is one thing that we can celebrate along the journey, beginning or end. That's my piece. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omar. That was very powerful. Thank you for speaking the truth. Jenna, you have the final word.
I'll be brief so that we have time for questions. I just want to say yes to everyone else's comments. Yes. We know there's inherent privilege and bias embedded into practices and processes within organizations, which create inequality and inequity within the organization. We need to address these. We need to take a sober look at structural and systemic issues that allow these biases to be perpetuated in the workplace. We need to also invite diverse perspectives to the table as we're looking at the structures and systems within these organizations. If we don't, we're going to be looking at it through one lens only. We need multiple lenses, multiple voices around the table to start addressing these issues. We need diverse knowledge, diverse experiences, and diverse lived experiences around the table as well. Organizations need to ask the question, what are some of the system and structural issues that exist in their organization, and how can they deconstruct them, their oppressive systems for the majority of the organization, so that they can create a more inclusive and equitable place to be. Education is a start. However, the action needs to follow the education. Final thought, Dialogue New Brunswick does this really well. We all need to lean in and ask hard questions and then listen and learn from everyone else.
Merci beaucoup, Jenna. Okay, so Milan, I turn it over to you to manage Q&A. We have about 10 minutes, so let's see how many we can get cracking.
Okay, great. So Dr. Critchlow, I think you would like to provide an answer on Raymond's question. So what is, and the question was, why it's that most leaders said, wait on time will change things.
Oh, so, sorry, you were cutting off a little bit, Milan. I didn't get it.
I apologize.
Yeah.
So I just said, I think you would like to provide an answer on Raymond's question, which is, he asked, why is that most leaders say, wait on time will change things.
Okay, thank you for the question. And again, I want to acknowledge the work you're doing here, because I think what often happens is people forget the amount of invisible labor that goes into this work, and the emotional labor that goes into this work, and the impacts that this work have on our families and our friends and our own personal health. So as I do this work, I want us to acknowledge the invisibility of all the stuff that has gone into making this project what it is today, working with Jane, Omar, and Nadine over the years, over the year to get to this state. So I want to recognize that. And Janet, it's a pleasure to meet you. Dr. Francois, same to you, and David. I didn't want to forget acknowledging all of you and Milan. I think what we are seeing more and more is we are told to be patient because if there are ways in which we pathologize people's behaviors when they seek change. And to pathologize people's behaviors is to look not at their strengths, but to find weaknesses and stereotypes or self-fulfilling prophecies to say they don't deserve it. So pathologize is another way of invoking a non-deserving clause to say you did not behave well. So patience is another way of saying behave yourselves. Well, we did not ask indigenous people to colonize them, we colonized them. We didn't ask Africans to turn them into slaves, we turned them into slaves. So why should we be patient today when the historicity of colonization and slavery was not one that was negotiated on the terms of the people you colonized and destroyed? That's the first question we must try to understand and make sense of. No one colonizes innocently. So don't expect anyone who is seeking change to bring this framework of a Eurocentric approach that has historically oppressed you to use you to dismantle the work. Audre Lorde said that master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. We have to look at things differently. We have to do things differently. And last but not least is the question of attending to the workplace in a manner that is not really about the maintenance of a corporate culture and one in which you mentor folks to become like you as a manager. The problem with mentoring is I don't have access to the same resources you have had access to. So you can't mentor me to be a good employee. You have to give me the tools to become a good employee. Very different. And mentoring is often misused as this process that is required for me to get to where you are, when in fact it's an investment in me. And when you invest in me, you have to allow me to tell you what that investment requires. But often that investment comes at a price. I'm paying for you to do this, therefore you're going to do what I want you to do. And so I think it's incredible that we recognize that EDI work is not new, and that when we look at the whole civil rights movement, when we look at the whole history of people fighting for rights, the suffragette movement, the queer movement, the disability movement, these struggles remain in our DNA on a daily basis to strive for a world in which equality is going to come about. So that patience that people want you to have, I often argue it's one in which they're asking you to maintain the status quo as is. And I'm saying we cannot, we have to disrupt the status quo.
Thank you, Dr. Critchlow. So this Q&A is very easy to manage. So I will invite other participants also to post their questions in the chat. So far, we don't have any other questions.
Milan, I don't know if Japna's question has been answered, because I think Francois had indicated he wanted to answer that question live.
Sure. So we have one question. It says, understanding that training is critical, but it can be a one-off. That person's just wondering what follow-up will look like for organizations. Creating culture, EDI, and cultural humility are ongoing processes. So what does accountability and consistent growth look like within an organization?
Yeah, I answered some of that when I intervened a little bit before, lamenting the fragmented approach of just training, for example. I would like to just highlight, though, the need. So highlighting and aligning all of the HR levers that exist, people levers, not human resource department levers, all the people levers that exist in an organization to promote those types of mindset, in addition to just training. The other element is, in my practice, I have learned that what is being measured is being done. So measurement becomes an issue as well. We measure ROIs, we measure a lot of things in organization, on time, on spec, on budget. Why don't we not add another one on DEI? So we need to have a appetite to collect the data, look at the data, and if we're uncomfortable with the data, make change to why we think that is, and involve everybody inclusively into defining the change. So a consistent, coherent approach to managing people and managing talent, and building culture of where anti-racism and tolerance and accommodation are accepted, but also measuring people, because we can very easily slip back and regress and become compliant, and that is not productive to what we're trying to do. Everybody loses from it. Everybody. The organization loses, the employee loses, everybody loses from a monolithic approach to managing people. That's my point.
Can I just respond to that really quickly, Mélène?
Sure, absolutely. Go ahead.
I agree with Francois, and what happens in organizations is that they become very uncomfortable doing assessments because they may not want to see the results that they get. And so we need to invite organizations to lean into this discomfort and see the truth, hear the truth, and then take action against the results that they see. So if they're going to do a belonging assessment and their belonging numbers are really low, that's a message. More work needs to be done.
And I just want to add, if I'll be brief, data collection, I don't disagree, but data collection is a very torturous experience for people who have been overstudied. So we need to be cautious of reproducing torture, violence on folks who have been overstudied. We don't need to study Indigenous people to know they have been historically colonized and disproportionately disadvantaged in the criminal justice system. There are millions of reports. We don't have to study Black folks to know this. So I want us to be cautious about data, because there's an assumption that data collection leads to good policy. Sometimes data collection can do the reverse. And we need to be cautious about data collection and really set clear goals, why you want it, what you want to achieve, and not just simply say, let's collect data to know what's going on, because data collection can slow a process sometimes and reproduce racial violence and torture on some folks.
Yeah, I might have been not clear. I didn't mean data collection I'm talking about, are people showing the right behavior, or the leaders showing the right mindset? So it's actually measuring people's accountabilities and behavior, not through a 360 assessment, for example.
Great, perfect. Wow, really a lot of powerful messages I heard today. We have other times, or it's pretty much we have to.
It's pretty much on time, and people who have been attending our public dialogues know that we're respectful of people's time. So I did ask the panelists to craft a quick response for, well, not quick, but who could respond to Ashley Brooks' question. We don't want to leave you hanging, Ashley. So while I wrap up and do conclusion acknowledgement, I invite our fellow panelists to please send type a response for Ashley's question, because it was very, very powerful. I will just read it very quickly so that people are aware of what that question was, which was, there's a great need for structural change. This has been acknowledged. As an Indigenous woman, I am curious, what are your thoughts on how organization would make impactful change? Specifically, how does this look in changes of policy and practice? So Omar, thank you. I see that you're typing. So I will go to wrap up in conclusion. Je vais les faire en français. Donc, je veux prendre vraiment un moment pour tout d'abord remercier nos experts qui étaient avec nous aujourd'hui. Donc, David, Waliwan, Walalan, thank you so much for being with us. Dr. Critchlow, you've joined us from Ontario. The same Francois, Omar, Jane, you are all not even located in New Brunswick. Thank you, technology and virtual dialogues to enable this. Jenna, thank you so much for being in attendance and a true ally. And of course, I want to thank my co-host of today, Mylène Lapierre from CPA New Brunswick, who's very intent on also being a leader and walking the talk. Alors, merci tellement pour être ici avec nous aujourd'hui. Bon AGA demain. Of course, I'd be remiss if I do not acknowledge the wonderful work of Yolande Chiasson, la traductrice qui était avec nous. Merci Yolande pour tout cet excellent service. Tu as toujours des excellentes notes en passant à tous les dialogues. Alors, merci pour ton travail. Thank you to Rogers for the interest in always attending our dialogues and les diffuser. Ça, c'est très, très apprécié. Terry, you've been wonderful as usual in putting out these resources. And finally, to our attendees, those who've been with us in this webinar, those who've been watching on Facebook Live, which I invite you to watch again. Merci. Waliwan, Waladen, thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for the invitation, and I hope we cross paths again and continue the work.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Bonne journée à tous.
Bonne journée.
Merci, au revoir.
Merci. Au revoir.
Thank you, everyone.
Mm-hmm.